This afternoon's session is an update and review of what's going on in carbon capture and storage from a number of different perspectives, and we're fortunate to have some very knowledgeable people here with us this afternoon for this session. Is same format as this morning. There will be a Q&A and panel discussion at the end of the presentations. I would remind you that the translation devices are available outside and that we're broadcasting in 3 languages. If you are asking questions or have an intervention, there are floor mics when we go to them. We need to use the microphones in order to assure proper translation services. Okay, well, I think we're ready to go for the afternoon. I'm going to call on my colleague from JPAC Canada, Laurent, is going to facilitate this afternoon. Laurent?
I strongly suggest you use your translation device because I'm going to speak French. Bonjour, bienvenue à cette session d'après-midi du Comité consultatif public mixte. So I'll give you a little bit of time to put your earphone. Donc la session de cet après-midi portera sur la capture et le stockage du carbone ou comme le professeur Kurtz me le rappelle de temps à autre, la capture et la séquestration du carbone. Je vais donc, dans un premier temps, vous présenter nos 4 invités cet après-midi, 4 éminents spécialistes. Je vais commencer par Robert Wright, des États-Unis. Monsieur Wright exerce ses fonctions de conseiller principal en planification et en analyse de l'environnement à l'Office of Fossil Energy of the Department of Energy of the United States. Il est également membre du comité consultatif du Fonds d'investissement stratégique en matière d'énergie du gouverneur du Maryland. Est-ce que la traduction fonctionne? Is the translation working?
No.
No?
No.
Okay, so I'll... Okay, so I'm going to wait. Donc, du début, bienvenue cet après-midi à cette session ordinaire du Comité consultatif public mixte. Le thème cet après-midi portera sur la capture et le stockage du carbone ou la capture et la séquestration du carbone. Il semble qu'il n'y ait pas d'anglais. Is it good in English? You have the translation? Good. Je vais donc débuter je vais commencer cette présentation en vous introduisant à Robert Wright. Monsieur Wright exerce les fonctions de conseiller principal en planification et en analyse de l'environnement à l'Office of Fossil Energy of the Department of Energy of the United States. Il est également membre du comité consultatif du Fonds d'investissement stratégique en matière d'énergie du gouverneur du Maryland. Il conseille actuellement les hauts fonctionnaires du Department of Energy à l'égard des programmes et politiques relatifs au changement climatique, au carburant de remplacement et au captage et au stockage de carbone. M. Wright a assumé le rôle de délégué du Congrès à la Chambre des représentants en 2007 et de conseiller législatif au Sénat en 2008. Il participe actuellement de façon très active à des travaux concertés avec le Canada et le Mexique sur le captage et le stockage du carbone, dont l'élaboration d'un atlas nord-américain sur ce stockage en vue d'établir un cadre d'énergie propre. Je vais poursuivre en vous présentant Werner Kurtz. M. Kurtz occupe le poste de chercheur principal au Service canadien des forêts de ressources naturelles Canada à Victoria, en Colombie-Britannique. Il est détenteur d'un doctorat en écologie forestière de la University of British Columbia. Il dirige l'élaboration du système national de surveillance, de comptabilisation et de production de rapports concernant le carbone des forêts, ainsi que du modèle de bilan du carbone du secteur forestier canadien. Fait à noter, M. Kurtz est co-auteur des 5 rapports du groupe d'experts intergouvernemental sur l'évolution du climat, connu en anglais sous l'acronyme du GIEC, dont le chapitre du groupe de travail numéro 3 sur les possibilités d'atténuation dans le domaine forestier. Il coordonne également les travaux du groupe d'études sur le carbone de l'Union internationale des instituts de recherche forestière et occupe le poste de professeur auxiliaire à l'University of British Columbia ainsi qu'à la Simon Fraser University. La Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences lui a décerné un doctorat honorifique en 2009. Je vais poursuivre en vous présentant notre expert mexicain sur ce panel, José Miguel González. Monsieur González a obtenu un diplôme d'ingénieur en électromécanique de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, ainsi qu'une maîtrise et un doctorat en génie mécanique du MIT, dans le domaine du transfert de chaleur et d'énergie. Il a commencé sa carrière professionnelle en 1972 à la société General Electric, en Californie, dans le domaine des réacteurs nucléaires. M. González dirige actuellement la division de l'Instituto de Investigaciones Eléctricas, qui se consacre à la production d'énergie conventionnelle. Il est le promoteur des projets de captage et de séquestration de carbone, domaine dans lequel l'Instituto de Investigaciones Eléctricas a pris la tête de quelques groupes de travail au Mexique. Il représente également le secrétariat de Energía du Mexique dans le cadre du Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum, ainsi qu'au sein du groupe de travail sur l'énergie qui est en train d'élaborer un atlas nord-américain sur le carbone, un projet concerté du Canada, des États-Unis et du Mexique. Finalement, je vais vous présenter Dale Friesen. Il est vice-président Relations autochtones, santé et sécurité, environnement, ça fait beaucoup de choses, au groupe ATCO Services publics. M. Friesen s'occupe de l'élaboration de la stratégie du groupe et du cadre de relations avec les Autochtones. Il est responsable de l'établissement des buts et objectifs du groupe en matière de santé, de sécurité et de gérance environnementale. En 2008, M. Friesen a été nommé vice-président des projets environnementaux pour les filiales ATCO Power et ATCO Energy Solutions. Je vais donc céder la parole à Robert Wright. Merci.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's always a pleasure to come to a meeting like this. You have questions. They seldom get answered. In fact, what happens is you have more questions, but at least you leave with a better understanding of the material that you're challenged with. I also want to say I think this is the first time my bio has ever been read in French. And it's interesting. It was in English. You translated it in French. And then we got an English version back, so I found that very, very interesting. The other thing I want to do is, since I was here in the morning session, is just to say a few words about carbon capture and storage from a different perspective. Someone has said, well, why aren't we doing this? Well, no company, no organization is going to actually deploy or install carbon capture and storage on their system, electric power plant, oil sands, whatnot, until there is a price for carbon. And except for British Columbia, which is my takeaway from this meeting, I didn't think there were too many places in the world that had a price on carbon. We certainly don't have one at the moment in the United States. Now that price can be set by a tax, by cap and trade. Another way of doing it might be through some legislation that makes it a requirement. So that's the reason that no one out there is implementing on a large commercial scale carbon capture and storage. So that's one point I wanted to make. The other point is then why are we doing all this? And I think it's what we in the United States refer to as a no regrets approach. If we really wait until climate change legislation is passed in the United States it could be a number of years in which we would do nothing, and then the technology would have to rush to catch up. So I think it's a small price to pay, is while we're listening and waiting for that final piece of legislation to continue to work on bringing the technology to a state that it could be deployed on a commercial scale. Now, I think it's the right one. Yes, that's good. What I want to do is to take some time to talk about the framework of how carbon capture and storage is implemented in the United States. It's done through the Department of Energy, and basically we can divide it into three different categories. There's the research and development category, the demonstration category, and the deployment category. In the R&D, there's the capture part. We're doing work in that particular area. If you know anything about carbon capture and storage, it's the capture and the compression that are the energy-intensive and expensive parts of the process. They can be done today commercially. It's done in a number of places around the world, but that penalty that one pays, both from a cost point of view and a energy penalty point of view, is too great. So we're working in that particular area. We in the United States have spent a lot of time looking at the storage part. All the things that have to be done to assure ourselves that this is a safe and feasible and appropriate way to go. The monitoring, what instruments we need, the verification, the accounting of it. Do some injection tests, work our way up from very small injections to very large injections. To have models that predict when we're doing that injection, make sure our models and we understand what's going on. And then to do some risk analysis, some risk assessment. Everything we do in life has a certain amount of risk with it. We want to know what that risk is, and we want to know what the possible mitigation approaches are if something happens. Also in the United States, at least, we believe in the area of electric power generation, if you're going to, let's say, gasify coal and produce hydrogen, you're either going to use it in a very large fuel cell or you're going to burn it in a hydrogen gas turbine. None of those exist today, and so we're doing research in that particular area. When we move on to the demonstration phase, it's a two-part. There's the research demo, which occurs in our regional carbon sequestration partnerships, and I'm going to talk more about those. And then there are the commercial demos, especially associated with electric power generation. That is, we have a clean coal power initiative. It's very much like our clean coal technology program in the 70s and 80s, which was successful. Round 3 of that particular program was to address carbon capture and storage in electrical power plants. And so that's part of the demonstration. Then we're going to move on to deployment. All these things we do, especially in the demonstration part of it, are going to be documented in best practices manuals. We are working with our Environmental Protection Agency in order to develop the appropriate rules and regulations for it. And the other thing we want to do is be aware that as this takes time, new technology will come along, and we want to be able to integrate that in at the deployment phase. One of the comments or questions that has always arisen, both at the G8 and the G20 level, is we need plants. We need integrated plants that are doing carbon capture and storage. Those plants are very expensive. They run in the order of several hundreds of millions of dollars to $1 billion, and we were not able to do that with our annual appropriations, which I'll talk about in a moment. But in the Great Recession, as we call it, we had a stimulus funding, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and that really allowed us to begin to build some of those plants, and I'm going to talk about those. The next slide basically talks about our annual appropriation. We have been doing research in this area for the last 13 years. It's been a partnership with our private sector, so there has been private sector investment, totals 39% of the overall cost of doing this. And if you add up the annual appropriations we have spent in doing projects already to date, $1 billion. We have over 100 active R&D projects at the moment, and you can see by the pie chart that most of that 60%, is going into our regional carbon sequestration program. Well, what is that program? Well, back in the early 2000s, we felt we had to get a handle on what does the public know about carbon capture and storage? What do the officials know, elected officials at the state level, at the municipal level? What do the regulators know, federal level, state level, municipal level? We had to find out what they knew. We also wanted to do what we call a baseline of our sources and sinks. For example, in the United States, EPA collects information on CO2 from emissions from power plants, but who collects it for refineries? Who collects it for cement plants? So that sort of had to be sorted out. Somebody must be collecting it, and if somebody wasn't, we needed to find a way to do that. And the other aspect of that is knowing where the sources are and the amounts they're emitting. Where are the opportunities to actually store that? Where are our sinks? And the other thing I think I mentioned is we wanted to actually start some injection tests at a small scale and work our way up and to validate this particular technology. Those regions were self-selecting, and as you can see, it turned out 4 Canadian provinces were very much interested in being part of that regional partnership, and so we're very pleased that that occurred. One of the things that came out of Phase 1, and the regional partnership had 3 phases, was a national atlas. It's been published in its 2nd edition, and it identified the sources, and we'll see in the next slide where those sources are located. But it also looked at the sinks and whether they are oil or gas fields, or whether they are unminable coal seams, or whether they are saline formations. We had to understand where they were, and we had to derive a methodology that would allow us to estimate the capacity of what those various types of sinks would hold. Now, that methodology makes that estimation based on what we call a resource. It's like this, which is we can tell you, if you're really going to implement carbon capture and storage, where you should be drilling the wells to get more information. It should be over here where we think there's a lot of capacity, and not over here where we think there's none. But when someone goes to implement it, they're going to have to drill additional wells. Wells and their characterization and the analysis that go with it are quite expensive. But the good news coming out of this is certainly for the United States, and we believe for North America in general, is we have more than enough capacity in the sinks for the emissions that occur in the United States and in North America. And you can see on the chart what that estimate is. We have a low estimate and we have a high estimate. And even using the low estimate, we're quite pleased with the results. Now, the other reason you want to do an atlas, and I think it's one of the first steps for any country that is considering implementing carbon capture and storage, and those are the countries that are heavily dependent on the use of fossil fuels. You have to know where your sources and your sinks are and how they align. And in this particular graphic, the diameter of the circle is the, not the capacity, the amount, the quantity that's emitted. The larger the diameter, the more CO2 emissions. And then the blue, I think it shows up as blue, the dark blue is where the capacity estimate is higher for storing it, okay? And you can begin to see where the alignments are. Now, certainly in the Gulf Coast area, which is where there's a lot of energy, a lot of CO2 emissions, we also have a lot of capacity. It tends to be true in the Midwest, the Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Kentucky area, and that's all very good. But there are obviously some areas out there that they are not sitting on top of a sink. And so the issue becomes, if they're going to address their CO2 emissions, they're going to have to talk about a pipeline, and where should those pipelines go? And there's a whole discussion evolving about will those be individual pipelines initially between a particular source and a particular sink, or does it make sense to do what would be called a trunk line? Now, the one thing I want to say is transporting CO2 is not new. It's been done for a number of decades in the United States. In fact, in the western part of the United States, in the area of Colorado, there was actually drilling going on to find natural pockets of CO2. That CO2 is then compressed, put in a pipeline, and sent down to the Permian Basin in Texas, where it is used in enhanced oil recovery. We have over 3,000 miles of CO2 pipeline in existence today. And there are companies such as Denbury who have pipeline in the Gulf Coast region who are planning and are out there seeking sources of CO2 and rights of way or routes for a pipeline that would run up through the Midwest. So this is a very important aspect to have this atlas. I'm going to focus a little bit on Canada because Dr. Gonzalez is going to talk about Mexico and what we're doing there in this trilateral agreement. This particular graphic comes from NRCan. It certainly lists the sources, and it doesn't necessarily list the capacity estimates. It lists the basins where some of those basins will actually, capacity estimates will be made. So it's not quite there, and part of the cooperation that we're doing is talking about sharing and using the same methodology among the three countries for those capacity estimates. And if we're going to exchange information to have, let's say, a North American atlas, at what's the minimal data set and in what sort of format must that data set be in order to share it. What I find interesting about this is that a lot of the sources in Canada are very close to the border, and it may make sense for some provinces to be thinking about the opportunity, and I use the word opportunity, that the sink actually might be closer and more available to them in the United States. And so I believe that's one of the reasons we continue the dialogue. We expect very much the same thing to happen as we develop a map with Mexico. Now, because of that possibility, there is a U.S.-Canada Clean Energy Dialogue. It actually had 3 parts. CCS was one of those parts. We had a meeting in June in the United States, of which people from the federal government and from the provinces and from the private sector met for a day and a half, and we came up with 7 action items that we would like to continue in CCS under the dialogue. One of them, which had started under the North American Energy Working Group, was this North American Carbon Atlas. We call that group the North American Carbon Atlas Partnership, or NACAP, and Dr. Gonzalez is going to talk a little more about that. We also thought that we should continue to explore opportunities in CO2 injection and storage. There is a project, Weyburn, that was using CO2 that was captured at the gasification facility in North Dakota. That project got off based solely on economics. The gasification facility, which was producing a syngas, had to separate out the CO2 anyway, but was emitting it into the atmosphere. Agreements were struck on an economic basis to take that CO2, which was being emitted, to compress it, put it in a pipeline, and send it up and use it in the Weyburn fields for enhanced oil recovery. What we plan to do now in that area is there are 2 wells that have now been, I'll use the word decommissioned, but they've been using CO2 enhanced oil recovery for a number of decades, and we're going to jointly fund the analysis of the condition and the integrity of those wells to see whether the decades of CO2 enhanced oil recovery had any effect on their degradation. Next generation technologies, all the things you generally hear about today are talking about what we can do today and maybe some incremental improvement. But we both agreed that we needed to start talking about more advanced ways or next generation ways. Working towards compatible rules and standards. Enough about that. We talked about harmonization. No one at that meeting thought we could harmonize, okay? They all thought we needed to make them compatible. Knowledge sharing on large-scale CCS projects we think is quite valuable, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Strategies for public engagement. Both countries, all countries will be engaged in a discourse with the community or the area that they would hope to do CCS. And so we find there's a lot of similarities there, and we ought to be talking about how we're going about doing that, what are the questions that the public has, and what are the appropriate answers. And lastly, it was a bilateral national conference, probably a wrong choice of words. It's really another roundtable, a group of maybe 50, 60 people, not a conference. And what I want to report is the second roundtable. is actually going to occur on May the 10th in the United States in Pittsburgh, right before the 9th annual CCS conference that's held in the United States. We decided that we would devote that entire day to knowledge sharing and large CCS projects. And in the morning, what we're going to do is sort of talk about what does knowledge sharing mean, how do we go about doing it, and then we are inviting, and it is an invitation by each government, all the organizations, basically companies, that have large-scale projects and say, you heard us talk about it this morning, what do you think? What is it you need that you would be willing to give up something to get from this knowledge sharing? So I think it's going to be a very, very productive day. Now, a lot of people said, I want to come to that meeting. I'm sorry, it's by invitation and you have to have a large-scale project. But at that same conference, on Wednesday afternoon, we have a session that is solely devoted to the U.S.-Canada Clean Energy Dialogue, in which 5 of these topics will have papers presented, one by a Canadian author and one by a U.S. author. Those are open to the public. If you're really interested in the things that are going on in these activities, I would encourage you to come to the conference, not just for that session, but for the conference in general. The other 2 things I want to go quickly by, because I know I'm going over my time, is the regional partnership had 3 phases in it. Phase 2 was to inject anywhere between a few thousand tons to maybe 10,000 tons into a well, into a formation, and to see that the models predicted correctly and to adjust those models. And we have 23 different tests. Most of those tests are complete. You can't read obviously the writing on the right-hand side of it, but it talks about the type of formation that it's being injected into, and these will be available on the web, and you can read it there. The really exciting part that we're coming into is phase 3. And in phase 3, we're talking about injecting 1 million tons of CO2. Now, a typical power plant emits somewhere between 3 million and 5 million metric tons of CO2 a year. So we believe injecting 1 million ton gets you into that range where it's not much of a risk or a challenge in going up by a factor of 2 or 3. There are 9 tests planned, and you can see where they're located geographically. The 2 things I want to say is in Area 6 in the CCARB, they have already injected their 1 million tons. And the other area that I want to point out is at Fort Nelson, which I believe is in British Columbia, is another test plan, and they have drilled their test well and are moving forward in that particular area. The other thing I want to leave you with is CCS, okay, is operating today. It's not operating in an integrated electric power plant. But Norway, 15 to 20 years ago, imposed a CO2 tax on emissions. And that was one of the first projects, which was Sleipner. The tax is about $50 a ton for CO2. Since this is a gas, both Sleipner and Snøhvit are gas processing, which means they found natural gas. It has 10, 15, 20% natural gas in it. They have to strip that CO2, or CO2 in it, they have to strip that CO2 out of the natural gas that they have found in order for it to be pipeline quality. Well, they would strip it out and admit it. At $50 a ton, it was much cheaper for them to drill a well underneath the seafloor, okay, in the Ustra formation, and to re-inject the CO2 there. About 1 million tons a year. Been doing it for 15 to 20 years. Snøhvit is just starting up. The Weyburn project, that's an integrated project. It's captured from a gasification process in North Dakota, compressed, put in a pipeline, and used in enhanced oil recovery. Insala and Rangli are other projects. So it's going on today. What seems to be lacking is an integrated process in an electric power plant. And that's what is the focus now in the United States. This slide is what we did with our stimulus funding. I'll quickly go through it. The research and development phase turns out to be our FutureGen project. They are in the process of sorting out the finances for that project. It's a project that's more than $2 billion, and the federal government of the United States is putting in $1 billion for that. And so that's ongoing. That's located in Mattoon, Illinois. The Clean Coal Power Initiative, we call it Round 3B. We had $600 million in Round 3. Remember, this is carbon capture and storage in electric power plants. And the stimulus funding allowed us to put another $800 million into that round. So we are spending $1.4 billion on this, and we have currently 5 projects that have been selected. Industrial carbon capture and storage. As I said, the focus, at least in the United States, has been on electric power plants, but ethanol plants, cement plants, other plants have CO2 emissions. And so money was set aside for those. We have 11 projects that were selected under this category. They were asked to flesh out, to put more meat on what they would do, and we expect a down selection in the next 3 or 4 months to 5 or 6 projects. In that same category was the opportunity to say, well, we're always talking about storage. What about a reuse? Some people have proposed that you make calcium carbonate in a brick form, and then you use those bricks in some way, and that's certainly a possibility. I think what's new and exciting in the United States is we've had a number of companies come forward and say they want to use the flue gas from a plant to grow algae. Algae requires CO2, and they could produce a liquid fuel, and that would be a reuse. So I think that's at the early stages of the research, but it's very, very promising. It would really be a great benefit if those projects could reach commercial scale. We also wanted to do some geologic formation site characterization. Remember, I told you the atlas says if you're going to want to store, here's where you drill to get more information. We felt that if we could drill in maybe 10 sites, promising sites around the United States, drill some of those wells, that we would be a step ahead of when they would be needed, and so we've done that. And lastly, all the technologies that I've heard, even the renewables, talk about if we really become serious about all of this and we start to deploy a lot of the technologies, where are we going to have the labor force? And it's not just the engineers and scientists coming out of the universities. It deals with the technicians, whether it's an electrical tech or an instrument tech. Okay, it may deal with the welders, okay, or the mechanics. Are we going to have enough if we really get serious about this and move forward? I talked about U.S. projects. I didn't want to leave out Canada, and I'm not going to talk about these projects, but I want to indicate in the 4 western provinces here, you have a number of projects going. I expect a number of those organizations to be present in May to talk about what they're doing and how they view knowledge sharing. Finally, another interesting thing, which is on Google Earth, a great innovation that our National Energy Technology Laboratory has is to take Google Earth and put the projects around the world on that world map. And if this were a live demonstration, you could click on one of those dots and it would start to pull up project information. And I believe that's the end. I appreciate your patience. I really think that CCS is one of those technologies that is going to make a significant contribution to climate change. The wedges, if you've ever seen any of the wedges, have to use all of the technologies. If you take any one of them, whether it's climate change or nuclear or the renewables, the result is that all the others are even more challenged and the cost of addressing climate change goes up. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you to the organizers for giving the opportunity to give this presentation this afternoon. I'm going to talk about the role of forests in carbon sequestration and storage, and I will, in my presentation, talk about the contribution of forests to carbon sequestration, as well as mitigation options in the forest sector, and I'll have some brief conclusions. I will talk about sources and sinks, but for us in the terrestrial ecosystems, a source is an area of land where the net balance of greenhouse gases is a net emission to the atmosphere. A sink is an area where we have a net balance that is from the atmosphere into the ecosystems. Forests play an important role in the carbon cycle. 50% of the dry weight of wood is carbon. A cubic meter of wood, that's roughly the amount in a telephone pole, contains a quarter ton of carbon, and if you burn that, you release roughly a ton of CO2. Carbon in 1 cubic meter of wood is also similar to the amount of carbon in about 350 liters of gasoline. At least once today we have to see this graph. It is the so-called Keeling curve that shows the rate of increase in CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. We have now surpassed 390 parts per million, and just recently. That's a 39% increase above pre-industrial levels. But what is perhaps more significant is that in the 1990s, the rate of increase in the atmosphere was about 3.2 gigatons. That's billions of tons of carbon per year. And despite the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol and various other initiatives globally to try to address this issue, the rate of increase of carbon in the Earth's atmosphere since 2000 has increased to 4.1 gigatons of carbon per year. It's a growth rate of 3.5% per year. The reason for this is the human perturbation to the global carbon cycle. We all understand that we have two primary anthropogenic sources of carbon to the atmosphere, namely the fossil fuel burning, but also about 18% of emissions come from clearing of forests and conversion to non-forest land uses, the so-called deforestation issue that is being addressed by the REDD initiatives around the world. REDD is the reduction of emissions from deforestation and degradation. But what is important in this diagram is that this perturbation to the global carbon cycle is actually also resulting in changes in two of the major carbon sinks, namely the terrestrial systems and the ocean systems. The so-called airborne fraction, the proportion of anthropogenic emissions that is remaining in the atmosphere, has been around 43%. In other words, for every unit of fossil fuel that we have released, we have been getting a 50% discount in what remains in the atmosphere because oceans and land ecosystems have historically taken up about 50% of that carbon that we've emitted. The important question for us all to address is how global climate change and the changes that we bring about with these additional carbon burdens to the atmosphere will influence the future behavior of these aquatic and terrestrial carbon sinks. Do a thought experiment. Look at the era of forest uptake. That's 2.6 billion tons of carbon per year globally. If these forests were to saturate, in other words, if they have reached the maximum amount of carbon they can take up, or worse, if they were to become carbon sources due to forest fire increases, insects, or other disturbances, then the rate of atmospheric CO2 concentration increase would greatly go up. And the point I want to make is that understanding how forests will respond to global climate change, therefore, has profound implications for the rate of future CO2 concentration increases in the Earth's atmosphere. Forests play an important role. They remove carbon from the atmosphere. They store it in wood, dead organic matter, and soils. They also, however, release large quantities of carbon through decomposition and, from time to time, through fires. What we are interested in are not the gross fluxes. What we need to understand are the net balance, the balance of sink or being either a sink or the source, which is the difference between large fluxes both into and out of forest ecosystems. Harvested wood products, the things we make from wood, store carbon in use, and beyond their end of life, they also store carbon in landfills. But they also produce another second important contribution to society because harvested wood products can be used to substitute energy emissions-intensive materials like steels, concrete, and plastic. And woody biomass can be used as a source of renewable energy. Through our work with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we emphasized the need to take a systems approach in looking at the contribution of forests to the global carbon cycle. If we look at the rules of the Kyoto Protocol, we would come to the conclusion that what we need to do is maximize the amount of carbon we store, because that's the only way in which you would get a credit for carbon uptake, namely the net increase in carbon stocks in forests. What we have highlighted, however, that we really need to take a broader systems perspective, because forests are the source, the renewable source of both bioenergy and wood products that we use to meet society's demands. If we curtail the availability of these materials without reducing the demands by society, we will see increases in emissions in other sectors, such as increased use of fossil fuels, either as an energy source or as the energy source that is required to produce steel, concrete, plastics, and other material that we would have to produce more of if we have available less wood. We also need to look at land use in a more systematic perspective, because if land use change decisions, either deforestation in order to make more room for more agricultural land, or the inverse, afforestation that is taking away land for production of food crops, will have influences on the greenhouse gas balance of the non-forest land uses. To give one example, if we expand forests into agricultural land without reducing the demand for food, which is obviously not going to happen, the response of farmers always has been to increase the energy intensity of farming, which means if we reduce the land available for food production, we will invariably increase the emissions associated with food production because of the more energy-intensive cultivation methodologies. So rather than looking at how much carbon can we store in forests alone, we really need to look at forest management and the use of forests to provide goods and services in a systems perspective. And what we need to do nationally and ultimately globally is develop ways in which we minimize the net emissions to the atmosphere rather than necessarily just maximizing how much carbon we store in the forests. And this brings me to the heart of this whole debate right now, that on the one hand we have groups who argue that what we must do is stop logging because logging is robbing the carbon bank, as it's being argued. A perception that is in part based on the fact that under the international accounting rules, when wood is taken out of the forest, we have to report it as an immediate emission to the atmosphere, regardless of what happens with that wood subsequently. And of course, this and many of the other panels around here are all made from wood, so obviously that was not immediately emitted to the atmosphere. And that's why the other side of that argument is stating that what we need to do is use wood, a renewable resource, to tackle climate change. The problem is, in part, aggravated by a failure to understand the underlying science. And the underlying science is that when you disturb a forest ecosystem, for some years after the disturbance, whether that's harvest or fire, you have a reduction in carbon stocks because the losses through the decomposition of the dead organic matter exceed the uptake due to the regrowth of the young trees. Some years later, the tree growth takes up more carbon than is emitted, and eventually you reach some sort of plateau of high carbon stocks depending on the disturbance regime and the age of the forest. The reason I'm telling you this is because when we try to decide whether we should maximize the amount of carbon we store in forests or maximize the rate at which carbon is taken up from the atmosphere, you will see in this diagram that we have to decide. We cannot do both at the same time because old forests store the maximum amount of carbon. Middle-aged forests are the ones that have the greatest rate of removal of carbon from the atmosphere. We as a society will need to make some choices, and which choices we make depends on ecosystem-specific considerations that not depend on carbon alone. Going back to that systems diagram, we have one option where we allow forests to grow very old, to store large quantities of carbon. That means we have to reduce harvest rates, which means we have less material available for biofuel and wood products and more fossil fuel emissions, or the alternative view where we have predominantly somewhat younger forests, we have much greater uptake of carbon from the atmosphere, but in order to maintain that sequestration, that removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, we have to keep taking some of that carbon out of the ecosystem and feed it into society's needs, and in doing so, hopefully, we are reducing the emissions from fossil fuels. When we do this analysis of which way to go with the management of forests in North America, we need to understand that sustainable forest management can maintain carbon stocks. We can have a continuous process of harvesting as much or less as is regrowing, taken up from the atmosphere. But eventually, so we can maintain carbon stocks over time. Harvested wood products will eventually saturate because there's only so many houses we can build, there's only so much carbon we can put into paper and pulp. But eventually, we can have continuous increases in landfills, but we don't want to do that because if you put wood into landfills, you end up with methane emissions, so there's much better uses that you can do. But the one that gives us the benefits that accumulate over time is basically the substitution benefits that accrue every time when you use wood products in an appropriate way. The alternative view is to basically say, okay, no, we don't want that. We want more carbon in the forests, so we reduce harvest rates, we reduce the anthropogenic influences, and that allows more carbon to accumulate in the forest, but it means that less carbon is accumulating in harvested wood products and less substitution benefits accrue over time. The net balance of these two alternative ways to proceed depends on many different factors that we can't discuss in the 20 minutes we have here. But the key thing is that as a society, we have to make some choices, and we have to understand the consequences on the greenhouse gas balance of some of these choices. And ultimately, these decisions will not be made based on carbon alone, because biodiversity, wildlife habitat, and many other factors also, of course, need to be considered when we deal with forest management. In our IPCC work, we highlighted 4 major things that we can do to increase carbon in forests and to mitigate, make contributions to climate change issues. The first is to increase or maintain forest area, which is why there is this huge emphasis on the reduction of tropical deforestation in particular. As I said earlier, 18% of the global emissions come from deforestation right now, the conversion of forest to non-forest land uses. But there are also opportunities to increase afforestation subject to the constraints I said earlier. There's forest management activities we can do to increase the carbon density at the stand or landscape level without going into any great details. And finally, there are a number of things we can do to increase the amount of carbon that is stored in products and the reduction of fossil fuel emissions through bioenergy use. Which brings me to the last major topic, and that is this notion of carbon neutral bioenergy. There are 2 reasons why bioenergy is considered carbon neutral. The first one is fundamentally an accounting artifact, namely that under current accounting rules, we have to treat harvest when we remove wood from the forest as if it was an immediate emission to the atmosphere. The reason we can export 1 million tons of pellets to Europe to produce bioenergy over there, and the Europeans can consider this to be carbon neutral, is because the emissions have already been accounted for when the trees were removed from the forest in British Columbia. It's important to understand that these rules are under discussion and they could be changing in the future. The second point is that regrowth, or growth, has either in the past or will in the future remove that carbon from the atmosphere. And that is a very valid point, but we have to consider the time frame over which this removal occurs. If we look at agricultural residue crops for bioenergy use, obviously that carbon was taken up in the previous growing season, or will be taken up again in the next growing season. If we look at, say, a willow plantation, short rotation forest management that has a 3 to 5 year crop cycle, again, it's over a relatively short period of time. But if we deal with forests, in particular boreal or northern forests where rotation lengths could be measured in many decades or a century, the time frames differ. And we need to keep that in mind when we start making assessments about the implications of bioenergy. It is therefore particularly important that if societies start to consider large-scale increases in the demand for woody biomass to meet bioenergy demands, that we ensure that we do a full account of the implications of such policy changes on the carbon stocks in the forests. It is important, therefore, that even if we treat bioenergy as carbon neutral, that we do a full assessment of carbon stock changes in the forest ecosystems. Sustainably managed bioenergy plantations, in particular those on land that is not used for food production, can remove large quantities of carbon per hectare, and there's a lot of knowledge about this with willow plantations and hybrid poplar plantations and others. And they can basically provide a short rotation, sustainable feedstock for bioenergy production. But even if the emissions per unit of energy from biomass are typically higher than those from fossil fuels, which is the case, bioenergy is still a renewable resource and it can reduce the release of fossil carbon. We should not dismiss it. We should just be honest and do a full account of the implications of bioenergy use and not simply assume that it is a carbon-neutral pathway. In a carbon-constrained world, every sector of society will be expected to contribute to climate mitigation activities, and the forest sector is particularly well positioned because it is one of the very few areas in which we can have sustained removal of carbon from the atmosphere, and in doing so, provide timber, fiber, and energy to meet society's needs, and their use in turn reduces fossil fuel emissions as well. Forest mitigation strategies are compatible with sustainable forest management, both from a conservation perspective, increasing the amount of carbon we store in ecosystems, or from an intensive management perspective, where we have the goal of using these forests to provide energy and timber. As the value of carbon increases, we've heard several discussions in the course of today about the anticipated price increases of carbon, either through taxes or cap-and-trade systems or other mechanisms. The number of forest management options that become available, the area available for afforestation, and various potential bioenergy options all increase. Mitigation activities, however, in the forest sector require investments now to achieve future benefits. If we want to have the benefits of carbon uptake from plantations, well, we have to get these trees in the ground, and we have to wait a couple of years until their maximum growth rates are occurring. And in the further north you go, the slower the trees grow, of course. So in conclusion, mitigation opportunities, i.e. reducing sources and increasing sinks relative to a baseline, exist both in forest management and the forest product sector. Mitigation efforts and the resulting economic values of carbon and energy contained in wood may create new opportunities for the forest sector, for communities, and for the economy. However, limiting the impacts of climate change is one very important step towards maintaining the mitigation potential of forests. As I indicated earlier, in many parts of the boreal world, we already start seeing significant impacts of climate change, whether that's increases in forest fires, the very large mountain pine beetle outbreak in British Columbia, and various other processes due to drought and climate change mediated processes that we can observe. If we don't maintain the reproductive capacity of forests, that sink strength is going to be diminished greatly. Research is ongoing to assess the mitigation options in forests. There's a number of activities going on right now to better understand what we can do, where we can do it, at what cost, and with what implications for leakage, permanence, and some of the other issues. In the work of the IPCC in 2007, we concluded that a sustainable forest management strategy aimed at maintaining or increasing forest carbon stocks while producing an annual sustained yield of timber, fiber, or energy from the forest will generate the largest sustained mitigation benefit. In the last 3 years, I'm not aware of a single publication that would contradict this conclusion. The conclusions that were published 3 years ago still stand. However, having said all this, I want to leave you with a final slide, namely that forests and forestry cannot solve the problem of fossil carbon emissions. They can contribute to the solution, but ultimately, if we want to address the issues of CO2 increases in the Earth's atmosphere, we have to reduce the emissions from fossil sources. With that, I thank you very much.
Buenas tardes a todos. Yo voy a hablar en español para dar una variedad de lenguajes y voy a leer la presentación también para no exceder demasiado el tiempo. Distinguida concurrencia, es realmente un honor y un placer dirigirme a ustedes en esta ocasión y agradezco a los organizadores por haberme dado esta oportunidad. El tema que presento se titula Separación y almacenamiento de carbono, CCS, ¿por qué? El contenido de la presentación se muestra en la lámina. Los 3 primeros puntos se enfocan a comentar qué es CCS y por qué es necesario. Las 4 láminas siguientes presentan algunos datos y proyecciones para México y las acciones que se están llevando a cabo en el país. Y después se presenta el proyecto NACAP, North American Carbon Atlas Project, para terminar con algunas conclusiones. Empecemos pues con los temas de carácter general. En un escenario inercial, business as usual, las emisiones de dióxido de carbono en el 2050 llegarían a 62,000 millones de toneladas, mientras que se considera que para evitar un incremento de temperatura global de más de 2 grados centígrados, las emisiones en el 2050 deberían de ser de menos de 14,000 millones de toneladas. 14 gigatoneladas en lugar de 62. Este es el tamaño del reto. Debo hacer la aclaración, este es un estudio preparado por la Agencia Internacional de Energía y las cifras se refieren únicamente a las emisiones de dióxido de carbono derivadas del uso de combustibles fósiles. Este nivel de emisión, representa una emisión per cápita de 2 toneladas de dióxido de carbono por año. En la figura se muestran como rebanadas, wedges, los efectos de las distintas tecnologías de mitigación que pueden tener sobre las emisiones globales. Quisiera pedirles que concentraran su atención en las 2 rebanadas que aparecen en la parte superior, color rojo, y que presentan el impacto de la tecnología CCS aplicada tanto en el sector energético como en el sector industrial. Esta tecnología tiene la capacidad de lograr un 20% del total de reducción requerido. Perdón, me confundí por ver la lámina en inglés, pero continúo en español. En los estudios de la Agencia Internacional, cuantificaron también el impacto de no incluir CCS en el portafolio de tecnologías de mitigación. Y este impacto sería incrementar el costo para las economías del globo en un 70%. Las emisiones globales tendrán que reducirse de 7 a 2 toneladas por habitante por año, en un entorno en el que el uso de energía necesariamente deberá aumentar, particularmente en los países emergentes. La tarea es claramente gigantesca. Las posibles consecuencias del cambio climático son tan serias que no nos podemos dar el lujo de no actuar ante las dudas sobre la precisión de los estudios realizados. Ojalá y estos los convenza, como yo estoy convencido de la necesidad de CCS. Pero, ¿qué es la tecnología CCS? Es una tecnología que nos permite retener el dióxido de carbono antes de emitirlo a la atmósfera y almacenarlo de manera permanente. El primer paso, como se muestra en la figura, es la separación o captura del dióxido de carbono, lo cual se puede hacer de varias maneras y lo comento a continuación. El segundo paso es la utilización de este gas en algún proceso productivo o, como se prevé actualmente para la mayoría de las emisiones, el almacenamiento permanente en formaciones geológicas. Estas formaciones son similares a las formaciones que han mantenido gas natural y crudo a altas presiones durante millones de años. Esta lámina contiene demasiada información y me disculpo por ello. Hay 3 tecnologías probadas a nivel de planta piloto para la separación de CO2, que son postcombustión, precombustión y oxicombustión. Hay otras tecnologías en desarrollo, pero no han logrado el mismo grado de madurez que las anteriores, como son la separación por membranas o la utilización de medios biológicos que seguramente jugarán un papel importante en el futuro. Postcombustión. Es una tecnología en la que los gases de combustión que salen de una central se hacen pasar por un proceso donde primero se separa el CO2, absorbiéndolo en un solvente, y después se libera calentando el solvente, quedando esencialmente puro y listo para comprimirse y almacenarse. El costo principal de esta tecnología lo representan en inversión los equipos de absorción y separación y en operación el calor que hay que suministrar para que el solvente libere el dióxido de carbono. Esta tecnología para centrales térmicas tiene el atractivo de instalarse al final del proceso, por lo que se presta a un retrofit, aunque es necesario hacer modificaciones a las turbinas. Precombustión. Esta tecnología está asociada al proceso de gasificación, que no es más que una combustión parcial del carbón que produce un gas llamado gas de síntesis, formado por dióxido de carbono, monóxido e hidrógeno, que después se transforma en otro reactor a una mezcla de dióxido de carbono e hidrógeno, en el cual la separación es más sencilla debido a la alta concentración. El hidrógeno resultante es el combustible que se pasa por una turbina de gas, que como mencionó Bob Wright todavía no existe y está en desarrollo, para generar electricidad, o se usa en procesos industriales como la hidrogenación de hidrocarburos. Los atractivos de esta tecnología son la producción de hidrógeno, que tiene múltiples aplicaciones, y su mayor flexibilidad para manejar cualquier tipo de combustible que los sistemas convencionales de carbón, aunque es inicialmente más cara y tiene que diseñarse así desde el principio. El costo en este caso, en operación, es fundamentalmente la unidad de separación de aire y la energía requerida para la producción de oxígeno que se requiere en la gasificación. La tercera tecnología, oxicombustión, es realizar la combustión con oxígeno en lugar de aire, con lo que se obtienen productos de combustión que son esencialmente dióxido de carbono y agua. La tecnología se presta a retrofit en centrales existentes, aunque es necesario hacer modificaciones en los generadores de vapor. El costo principal de esta opción, nuevamente, es la unidad de separación de aire y la energía requerida para la producción de oxígeno. Es también la menos desarrollada de las tres opciones mencionadas, pero tiene atracción especial para algunos procesos industriales, como la fabricación del vidrio y del cemento. Como comentario final, quisiera simplemente apuntar que ninguna de estas tecnologías separa o captura la totalidad del CO2 que se produce y que se acaba emitiendo de todas formas del orden del 10% de lo producido. Y además no hay ninguna tecnología, ninguna de ellas, que sea un claro vencedor en este campo en que las tres compiten. En la lámina se muestran ahora los resultados obtenidos y publicados por el Instituto Global de Secuestro y Captura de Carbono, el GCCSI, a fines del año pasado, con los costos de distintas tecnologías, tanto en términos de costo de la energía eléctrica generada como del costo de la tonelada de dióxido de carbono evitada. Los costos están calculados con las condiciones actuales de las tecnologías y se espera que se reduzcan sustancialmente en los próximos años. El mensaje es claro: todas las tecnologías acaban con costos de electricidad parecidos, dentro de un rango de 20%, y con un incremento entre el 40 y el 80% en relación a los costos de energía sin utilizar CCS. La reducción de emisiones cuesta. Esto refuerza lo que ya dijo también Bob Wright, que no habrá ninguna empresa que aplique CCS mientras no tenga que hacerlo. Se requiere alguna regulación, legislación, acuerdo, donde las empresas tengan que aplicar CCS, de otra manera no estarán dispuestas a aceptar estos sobrecostos. En resumen, entonces, de lo expuesto hasta ahora, tenemos que para limitar el incremento global de temperatura, se requiere una reducción de 48 gigatoneladas de CO2 de las derivadas de combustibles fósiles sobre el escenario base de 62. La tecnología CCS puede aportar hasta el 20% de la reducción requerida en el año 2050, pero tratar de lograr las metas sin utilizarla representaría un sobrecosto del 70%. Hay en la actualidad 3 tecnologías maduras para la separación del dióxido de carbono, sin que pueda definirse ninguna de ellas como la ganadora. Y cualquiera de estas tecnologías tendría un incremento en el costo de la electricidad de entre el 40 y el 80%, aunque se espera que estos costos o estos sobrecostos se puedan reducir a un 25%. Con esto terminamos la parte global y pasamos ahora a hablar un poco de la situación en México. México tenía en el 2006 unas emisiones de 600 millones de toneladas de CO2 anuales, equivalentes al 1,5% de las emisiones globales. De estas emisiones, de las 600, 400 millones de toneladas son derivadas del uso de combustibles fósiles, incluyendo la generación eléctrica, los usos propios del sector energético y el sector industrial y el sector transporte, que en México representa cerca de la mitad. Esto representa una emisión per cápita de 6 toneladas anuales, 4 de las cuales se derivan de combustibles fósiles, y el ponernos en una emisión similar a lo que se pretende a nivel global representaría bajar de 4 a 1,5 toneladas per cápita. Se van a presentar ahora 2 escenarios de emisiones al 2050 en un modo inercial de operación, incluyendo políticas de mayor uso de carbón para diversificar combustibles y un mayor uso de energía nuclear. Las emisiones crecerían de 130 millones de toneladas anuales a más de 400, debidas fundamentalmente al crecimiento en el consumo de electricidad. Se supuso que México crecería en su consumo por persona de los 2,000 kilowatts-hora anuales que tenía hace un par de años a un valor de 8,000, que es similar a lo que tiene Europa el día de hoy. Y se presenta también el caso de no utilizar energía nuclear, que es la segunda gráfica que aparece a la derecha, en cuyo caso las emisiones subirían a más de 600 millones de toneladas. Las metas consistentes con lo que se pretende a nivel mundial representarían una emisión máxima del sector eléctrico de 75 toneladas por año. Entonces, este es el tamaño del reto, y la conclusión es que México claramente tendrá que usar CCS, tendrá que aplicar esta tecnología para reducir las emisiones de dióxido de carbono. ¿En qué medida? ¿En qué medida dependerá de las decisiones que se tomen en relación a la energía nuclear y también del éxito que se tenga en la implantación de energías renovables? Independientemente de esto, en mayor o en menor grado, es claro que México tiene que prepararse para esta nueva tecnología. ¿Qué se está haciendo en México en este tema? En términos generales, el país se está preparando para el gran reto que tiene que enfrentar con las emisiones de CO2. En lo interno, se inició el análisis técnico-económico de la aplicación de CCS en una de las centrales mexicanas que se va a convertir de combustóleo a carbón. Los centros de investigación del sector energético están ya desarrollando proyectos en las áreas de recuperación mejorada de hidrocarburos con inyección de dióxido de carbono y en las áreas de separación de CO2 con sus 3 tecnologías. Hay un proyecto privado para utilizar del orden de 1,6 millones de toneladas por año en cultivo de algas para producción de etanol. Este es un proyecto similar o compartido con el que mencionó Bob, que se está haciendo en Estados Unidos. Son proyectos distintos, pero la tecnología es esencialmente la misma. Dentro de los programas de colaboración internacional, se ha trabajado con el CSLF en programas de desarrollo de capacidad en México y se está analizando uno más ambicioso aún para iniciar este año. México es miembro fundador del Instituto Global de Secuestro y Captura de Dióxido de Carbono. Finalmente, dentro del Grupo Norteamericano de Trabajo en Energía, el NAEWG, se está participando en el desarrollo de un atlas regional de carbono para América del Norte, del cual haré algunos comentarios adicionales. Este proyecto se menciona de manera especial por ser un proyecto trilateral entre Estados Unidos, México y Canadá. El proyecto se desarrolla bajo el amparo del Grupo de Trabajo en Energía de Norteamérica. Se inició en el 2008, teniendo la primera reunión en Houston, organizada por Canadá, y las instituciones que encabezan los trabajos de cada uno de los países son el Departamento de Energía en los Estados Unidos, Natural Resources de Canadá y la Secretaría de Energía en México. El trabajo se apoya fuertemente en los trabajos ya realizados por las asociaciones regionales en los Estados Unidos. ¿Qué ¿Qué es el Atlas de CO2 para la región? Es una identificación, cuantificándolas, de las fuentes de emisión de CO2 en los 3 países. Es también una identificación de los sitios viables para el almacenamiento seguro de CO2, estimando sus capacidades, incluyendo yacimientos agotados de hidrocarburos, formaciones salinas profundas y yacimientos de carbón no extraíble. Todo esto presentado en un mapa digital interactivo. El propósito fundamental es dar una base de información a los gobiernos y a las empresas del sector energético que puedan utilizar en la definición de sus estrategias de mitigación de CO2. Y con esta última lámina termino presentando como conclusiones lo siguiente. La amenaza de cambio climático demanda acciones intensas e inmediatas por parte de todos los países. CCS es una tecnología necesaria dentro del portafolio de medidas de mitigación que puede aportar hasta el 20% de la reducción requerida en el año 2050. Hay actualmente 3 tecnologías para la captura del CO2, sin que haya un claro ganador. México necesitará CCS para lograr niveles de emisiones similares a los que se pretenden mundialmente. México participa activamente en los programas internacionales de colaboración y aunque no está en la lámina, no puedo terminar sin enfatizar que para un problema global como el del cambio climático son indispensables los programas de colaboración globales de manera intensa y real entre todos los países. Muchas gracias por su atención.
Good afternoon and gracias. It's a pleasure to be here today at this JPAC meeting, and I've really enjoyed listening to the fellow panel members talk about the various geological and terrestrial CCS opportunities and things that are happening here in a tri-country discussion. So today my presentation will focus on our Canadian experience and with a primary focus on the power industry. So the agenda is to talk a little bit about some of the emissions profiles in Canada, compare those around North America, take a look at some of the CCS projects and opportunities and government funding that we have in place right now. Thirdly is some of the challenges that we believe are faced by CCS projects, and just in summary, some of the ways that we can transition to a low-carbon economy and where CCS's role is in that. I call this a red dot map. What it shows is the CO2 emissions for both Canada and the United States. And if you look at the red dots, that's for the Canadian coal-fired, or the U.S. coal-fired power plants only for their emissions. And the orange represents the Canadian coal-fired power generation stations. So there's about 26 coal-fired plants in Canada and around 600 in the States. And the little blue dot you see in Alberta, if you can see that there, represents the emissions from the oil sands in comparison. This puts the overall emissions from power generation, well, for overall power consumption in the 3 countries, just in perspective. And in Canada, you have 62% of our power is generated from hydro sources. There's been a lot of really good discussion this morning on hydro, which I very much enjoyed. 75% of Canada's emissions or our power generation is from non-emitting sources. It's primarily hydro and nuclear, with the rest made up from thermal and some natural gas-fired plants. Just to recalibrate as to the amount of emissions that would be put out by various technologies, if you had a very standard coal plant, non-supercritical, you'd be putting out about 1.1 tons of CO2 per megawatt hour produced. By comparison, a combined cycle gas turbine towards the middle of that slide is about 0.4 tons, so about 60–70% less. And then if you go right to the bottom of the slide, you can see clean coal with CCS, which still have some small emissions, because at least in most of the projects that we've looked at or considered, you still have some emissions from the compression cycle, so you still have some residual. This was covered earlier, but it just compares conventional coal on the left with the CO2 being released to atmosphere, and on the right-hand side you see it being sequestered underground in a stable formation. If you look at Canada, there's several places that you can do sequestration, but they're not all created equal. And interestingly enough, the very best location for sequestering carbon is right in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, which is normally the green piece that you see coming through Alberta and Saskatchewan. And it does extend, of course, down into the States. These things aren't stopping at the border. But what is interesting is the darker green represents those areas which are deemed to be better and I guess the most desirable sequestration or storage locations. The lighter green are not quite as good. There's also CCS locations in other locations, but primarily you want to be sort of near the load. The Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, its claim to fame in the green is it has large hydrocarbon resources as well as great storage potential, which is a good mix. On the eastern seaboard, which isn't shown, just to the very far right, there's some other very good sequestration locations. So if we got into some offshore oil, there's potential that you might want to use those sites as well. Rob had a slide that kind of itemized all of the other locations in the far north as well. This is a summary on this slide of, it shows Alberta. You hear a lot about Alberta probably in the news with oil sands and different things. And we've also just committed to some fairly major expenditures of government money and private money for CCS projects. So what I'm going to show you here is just some of the where the money is going and just tell you very briefly about some of those projects that are being implemented. First one is Swan Hills Synfuels coal gas plant. It's using coal gasification, and they take the CO2 that's captured and they use it for enhanced oil recovery. There's a power plant where we're doing back-end capture in a coal-fired generating station using chilled ammonia, which is and then sequestering into a formation in the Wabamun area near Edmonton. Almost $1 billion are being spent on capture of CO2 at a bitumen upgrader from the oil sands, and then using the CO2 that's captured for enhanced oil recovery. And we have there was some discussion, Rob talked about 3,000 miles, I believe, of CO2 pipeline in the States, which is really quite amazing. I wasn't aware of that. This is a 240-kilometer pipeline that's being built in Alberta to take the CO2 from the source to the sink and also to use it for EOR. In neighboring province to the east, Saskatchewan, there's money being spent as well at the Boundary Dam coal-fired power station to capture CO2. Total government spend, provincial and federal governments, is about $3 billion proposed over the next 5–10 years, so it's fairly significant capital, and it's a commitment that shows that they're serious about trying to learn more about it. What I like is there's a nice mix of projects. They look at some different coal gasification, you've got some coal-fired generating station, you've got your post-combustion, you've got some CO2 pipelines. So there's a mix of technologies. As they gain experience from that, hopefully that can be used to lower the costs of CO2 capture and sequestration in the future and make it more viable. When we look at some of the challenges, there's really 4 main challenges that I see, and that's first is lower efficiency due to parasitic losses, liability that's associated with the storage of CO2 underground, regulatory uncertainty, which has come up in some of the other presentations, and just the economics are currently not viable with the carbon prices. I don't know if most people realize, but if you want to look at a 1,000-megawatt coal-fired generating station, and then you add CCS, you've just turned 1,000 megawatts into about a 600–700 megawatt power plant. And you've got the same amount of coal being consumed, and you've added to the cost of that electricity. So There's some great technologies that are out there in terms of air separation units and how they're reducing the cost of compression and sequestration, but that will take time to evolve. Currently, the parasitic losses are quite extensive. Liability. Who's liable for it and for how long? Those are questions that companies need to answer, and it gets very practical. If you're building a CCS project and you go to the bank and they look at you and say, who owns this problem? Who owns this problem 50 years from now, 100 years? Do we want to be a part of this project? And it can impact even getting financing for these. So governments maybe need to step in and take a look at, what role that they may play. Probabilities of leakage are low, and there's been a tremendous amount of work and effort to do the sink mapping in the States and some ongoing work in Canada and Mexico. But it's also, there are risks, and there have been 10 cases in the States since 1972 where there has either been property damage or property damage and loss of life. And so these things add to the liability and things that need to be understood. I'm jumping around here. If you look too at the costs, the economics, José has some pricing on there. I think it was around $120 or $122 was the mean price for coal with CCS, but that was the mean price from averaging what it would cost from once it's base business and then the startup, and they averaged them. But our numbers are actually quite a bit higher than that if you look at the original startup costs when it's still in its infancy. So of course those costs are higher. But they're still around 200% of supercritical coal, and currently requires government support. In a slide that I don't show today, we think if you don't have carbon prices in the $70, $75 range and up, it really isn't economic to even look seriously at CCS. And in the power industry, it's very important for us that the carbon price is recoverable fully in the electricity price. So if price carbon $70, we need to get the normal price of electricity plus the $70. And if they're not inextricably linked, then that can be a big problem with us for power industry recovering their costs. I've taken the numbers off here, but just in general terms, if you look on the left-hand axis, it's electricity price. So the higher line with the clean coal with CCS is the most expensive. The lower at the bottom, hydro, is the cheapest. And as you move from left to right, you look at the carbon costs increasing. So if the price of carbon is zero, well, it doesn't really matter much to a nuclear plant. It is what it is. But if you have a supercritical like the ramped line in the black in the middle arching up to the right, as the price of carbon goes up, of course, your electricity price will go up. In terms of deciding what to build, you'd have to ask yourself, if clean coal is more expensive than nuclear, you have a decision to make. First, you'd have to test, is that correct? These are rough numbers, but would you build clean coal ahead of nuclear? Or would you go to hydro? Maybe hydro is not an option. Maybe you'd build gas, maybe combined cycle, but you have to look at the various technologies and consider carbon price, electricity price, and just suitability for your location. Robin mentioned earlier about the opportunities to look at using sinks, possibly on the US side of the border, for us to take CO2 from Canada and sending it to a sink in the States. And if you look at the Weyburn example, we've actually taken CO2 from the States and pushed it into Alberta or into Saskatchewan, north of the border, and used it for enhanced oil recovery. So really just getting to the point of trying to match sources and sinks so that you have the most efficient, I guess, use of the resources and opportunity that we're faced with. And with that, I guess you look at it earlier discussion this morning, you talk about, the idea of corridors, and there's a lot of discussion on hydro and how that works. And we look at that and say, isn't it really the same? I mean, if you have, rarely do you have be fortuitous enough to have renewable energies exactly where you want them by the major load. Maybe that needs to be considered, that those renewables, find them where you get them and then transport them to the loads, and you have green corridors that would bring that power to the load, and that could really help lower the overall costs of green energy in North America and in Mexico. So I think it's just something to be considered. So to do that, I guess considering working with existing DOE and Canadian regional partnerships, two of the best ones are probably the Plains and Midwest. Some of the work that's going on, some real opportunities for Canada and the U.S. to do sharing of sources and sinks and maybe doing some partnership there. And then on the power side or transmission side, looking at the definitions of hydro. And I probably put this in wrong, this slide, but it really gets to the points that were made so well this morning on a lot of that discussion of, where does hydro fit from Canada into the States? How does that help solve a problem? In summary, 75% of Canadian power already comes from non-emitting sources, so we're very fortunate there. But we still have emissions to contend with, and we still have targets. And to achieve those, CCS could be one of the solutions. And there are 5 projects, at least, large scale, that are going on in Canada, a good mix of them to develop expertise in those technologies and to help share that and lower the costs of compliance further on. But more work needs to be done, and that takes time. That's not going to happen in just 1 or 2 years. It will take time. We've spent or committed to spending, the Canadian provincial and federal governments, around $3 billion for the 5 projects. The Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin in the Alberta-Saskatchewan area and then extending into the States is a prime location for both finding hydrocarbons and for CCS sink. And the CCS challenges efficiency, liability, regulatory, and costs. Next steps, I guess, continue the continental transboundary CO2 discussions, as we've talked about, and also looking at, as discussed this morning, the green transmission corridor and how that fits in to the overall strategy. That's it. Thank you very much.
Je tiens à remercier tous les présentateurs cet après-midi. Maintenant, on entre dans la période de questions. Donc, est-ce qu'il y a des gens qui ont des questions ou des commentaires dans la salle? Martín?
¿Sabes qué? También
Sorry.
Rodolfo. Si quieres, mejor primero Rodolfo y damos. El pobre no lleva 3 rondas sin preguntar.
Gracias, Martín. Una pregunta a los panelistas, en virtud de que esta reunión básicamente es para conocer sobre pues, estas nuevas fronteras tecnológicas y de reducción o de acciones de mitigación para reducir gases de efecto invernadero, y poder proponer a nuestros gobiernos, a través de las Secretarías de Medio Ambiente y las Secretarías de Energía, acciones a tomar. En realidad, nosotros como región tenemos un rol importantísimo en las negociaciones de cambio climático y en la reunión de las partes que se va a llevar a cabo en Cancún al final de este año, la COP16, the Conference of the Parties 16. Entonces, como no se llegaron a acuerdos en cuanto a reducciones numéricas, metas en Copenhague, hay una comunidad, pública, insatisfecha, hasta cierto punto frustrada, de que, pues, no obstante que existen todas estas soluciones que ustedes han comentado, los gobiernos no toman compromisos que afecten los negocios, en particular de energía. Este sector es el corazón del problema del cambio climático, y se espera que en Cancún se lleguen algunas soluciones que no se llegaron en Copenhague. ¿Qué le recomendarían ustedes a los gobiernos, a nuestros 3 gobiernos, para que haya haya una posibilidad de lograr la aplicación de estas tecnologías de una manera más agresiva e inclusive que permitan un acuerdo internacional que a su vez dé como resultado pues un mayor o que exista un precio de la tonelada de CO2 y todas estas tecnologías que hemos estado discutiendo a lo largo del día sean viables.
Thank you for your question. May I ask one of the experts to answer?
Well, my first instruction on leaving home is I don't make policy. I will say that I don't know that I have a direct answer to your question. I want to say just recently, and I assume it's in anticipation of a possible agreement, that our President Obama, called together an interagency task force in the United States with the specific question of identifying what will it take to move the deployment or cause the deployment of CCS to occur as early as possible. The two co-chairs of that task force are my boss, the Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy, Dr. James Markowski, and the Deputy Administrator of the Environmental Protection Administration. I forget his name at the moment. They have 6 areas. They're busy at work. The President asked for a report in 6 months. And what I can report is they divided it up into 6 areas. 3 of the areas deal with the technology, the capture part, the transport part, and the storage part. And then there are 3 other areas, and one of those was policy, and I assume he's looking for what policies would have to be implemented in order to aggressively deploy CCS. What regulations and legislation would it take to do that? And lastly, what would the incentives or drivers have to be? We talk about carbon price, but I think he wants a full report on what that's going to be. So supposedly in 6 months, at least the United States will have made a recommendation to the President as what to do in those 6 areas. And I assume, I don't really work in those circles, that it's to take whatever position they want to Cancun and be ready to negotiate.
Thank you. Señor, por favor.
Thank you. This is Miguel Berceda. I have a couple of questions for different panelists. Gathering information, this is for Bob Wright. Gathering information here and there, I came up with a number that in the last decade, and this is where I want your qualified opinion, in the last decade, the U.S. has spent like $8 billion in actual projects on CCS. Could you comment on that, if that sounds right? And another thing that you did mention, I forgot the whole name of the Economic Recovery Fund, which I think it has $543 billion as a total. How much of that that total is not for CSC projects, but it does say that it does state that some percentage of that will be used for backing projects in CSC in the future. So I just want to be able to have a number in the manner of Dale Friesen, who gave this $3 billion figure for Canada. And this goes, and this brings me to the next question. How about the discrepancies that Dr. Santaló has in terms of costs with the numbers that Dale Friesen gave? That would be a question.
Thank you very much. Please.
Well, the easy one is that our stimulus funding comes from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARRA, and although there were many billions of dollars in that, the slide I showed was $3.4 billion solely for CCS. And if you look at that slide, I tried to give you where that $3.4 billion actually was spent. The Recovery Act, recall, it has to be obligated in somebody's hands by the end of this year, and they have to spend it by, I think, the year 2014. But the simple answer is it's $3.4 billion. Now, the $8 billion that you mentioned, I'm not quite sure where that number comes from. I can tell you what the DOE budget has been over that 13-year period and what private sector has put in. It's a little greater than $1 billion on the geologic storage of CCS. There is an activity in the United States called Climate Change Technology, and that office, that person, was asked to add up all the money throughout the U.S. government that you could hang the title on it, climate change or climate change technology. I have heard a number there in the $6 or $7 billion range, so that would include what the Department of Agriculture is doing in that area. It would include what the National Science Foundation does in terms of research program areas. So it's much broader than the sort of the applied R&D that the Department of Energy does. If you have a reference or a source for the $8 billion, I wouldn't dispute it, but it's above and beyond what we're doing for the geologic storage of CCS.
Thank you. Please.
Sí, sobre las discrepancias en costos entre lo que presenté yo y lo que presentó Dale. Lo primero que diría yo es que me sorprende que haya tan pocas discrepancias, considerando que todavía no hay plantas construidas de plena escala sobre la cual haya datos. Él presentó unas estimaciones donde decía que el costo de la energía eléctrica con tecnologías de carbón supercrítico y secuestro y captura de dióxido de carbono sería 200%, más de 200% más caro que sin aplicar CCS. Lo que yo presenté hablaba de un 75% sobrecosto, o sea, hablaba de que no sería más de 200%, sería 175%. O sea, las cifras están bastante cercanas. Las cifras que yo presenté del instituto, el instituto presenta rangos de costos, dada la incertidumbre que hay de todas esas estimaciones. Yo aquí presenté el valor medio que ellos reportaron, o sea que ellos presentan un rango, y además presenté lo que ellos llaman el costo de plantas subsiguientes, no es el costo de la primera planta a construir que sería más alto. Entonces, yo creo que dada la situación actual de ausencia de proyectos comerciales ya construidos y experiencia en ellos, pues las discrepancias son más bien pequeñas, considerando que son estimaciones hechas por distintos grupos y organizaciones.
Thank you. Please.
I would just echo Jose's comments. I think he's exactly right. It was really the difference is I was using for a new startup, a new plant, and Jose's numbers were considering the mean average price once you compare the average between the initial startup costs when everything costs a lot more and then once it becomes business as usual. So I was using the higher number.
Okay, we have a question from Martin Gutierrez, from a JPAC member from Mexico.
Ok, son dos preguntas, una para Werner y otra para José Miguel. La de Werner, ¿qué opinas sobre los mercados de captura de carbono en proyectos forestales? ¿Y le ves alguna viabilidad para que existan compradores en Norteamérica y poder crear Se habla mucho del mercado trinacional o de Norteamérica, de cap and trade, pero no se ha considerado la parte de proyectos forestales como tal, o por lo menos no se ha puesto en la mesa. Y como tú comprenderás, en México nos interesa muchísimo, sobre todo en las zonas de manejo comunitario, la parte de la silvicultura y todo lo que se está haciendo en manejo sustentable de la madera. Me gustaría saber tu punto de vista y si ves una factibilidad real y una viabilidad real para que esto pueda suceder y no esperarnos al famoso expectativa que se ha generado para la COP16 y el famoso RED. Y José Miguel, quisiera preguntarte si tú crees que el Congreso mexicano entienda lo que significan los proyectos de secuestro. ¿Y tú crees que el Congreso mexicano estaría dispuesto a considerar en sus partidas del presupuesto las inversiones requeridas para esto? Honestamente lo veo a años luz, pero quisiera saber tu opinión. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. We're going to start with Mr. Kurtz.
Thank you for the question, and I will answer in English. Yes, scientifically, there are opportunities for forestry offsets, and I have only highlighted a number of them. Obviously, one that is of particular interest to Mexico right now is RED, and Mexico is a country that is currently engaged with the World Bank in discussions. We're working on the forest carbon tracking system to help Mexico identify current baselines of deforestation rates and quantifying what the implications of these are. And yes, if the world comes to an agreement, either at the next COP meeting in Cancun or at a future time, about how the reductions in deforestation can be translated into offset funds, any form of payment that can be used to compensate those who have changed behavior, and in doing so reduce the rate of deforestation. Those are all opportunities that exist. The problem that we have is that forestry-related projects, whether they are avoidance of deforestation or afforestation or changes in forest management or harvested wood products, etc., tend to be very complex. Historically, the protocols that are required for some of these projects have been very difficult to develop and negotiate. There's a few examples out there now, but a lot of them are still in the review stages, and some of the wicked problems involved are questions of permanence, questions of leakage, and the high transaction costs associated with the development of the baselines and the monitoring of the actual success of the activities that are implemented. I do think that there is good progress being made in the development of the protocols. I think the risk issue is being explored in a number of interesting ways, pooling risks through cooperatives, insurance of risks against future losses. Those kinds of complex issues are being addressed successfully, I think. But some of the other issues, like the high transaction costs, the difficulty of measuring what actually happens in these systems, will remain challenging. What I see emerging is that there are some clear opportunities, and there are some other forest-based activities that can be undertaken that are going to be useful as mitigation wedges and that help the atmosphere, but they may not lend themselves very well to be monetized in an offset framework. So there are activities that governments may choose to undertake or voluntary markets may choose to undertake, but they're much more difficult to translate into dollars. And I'll give you one example. We know that there is another big insect outbreak anticipated in eastern Canada. It's called a spruce budworm. It's a defoliating insect. And the science clearly demonstrates that there are things that can be done to reduce the impact of that insect. And there's some likelihood that will be undertaken at a particular level. But establishing what the baseline of the impacts would have been without human action versus the actual impact with human action is going to be quite difficult. And therefore, it's going to be very difficult to do that for the purpose of creating an offset project. So it may be the right thing to do from an atmospheric mitigation perspective, but it may not be a suitable thing for an offset project. And there are a number of examples like that in forestry and the forest sector. And I think what we need to do as governments and society trying to address these issues is learn how to identify the best mechanisms to address some of these mitigation options. Offset projects and monetizing the action to generate a flow of dollars may not always be the only or the best option available to us. And right now, much of the focus has been on, how do we create offset projects?
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez, for the second question, and then after we'll take 2 questions from the public. Thank you.
La pregunta es complicada, que opine si creo que el Congreso entiende o no entiende lo que es secuestro. Yo creo que el problema va más allá y está un poco relacionado con lo que preguntó Rodolfo. Uno de los problemas que tenemos en México es que todavía no hay el convencimiento pleno en los grupos científicos y tecnológicos de la necesidad del CCS. Se habla con el grupo que favorece la industria nuclear y dicen que ellos tienen la panacea. Se habla con los grupos que impulsan renovables y también dicen que para el 2020 puede ser todo solar. Y la realidad, mi opinión, es que ninguna de esas posturas es válida, que igual que el resto del mundo necesitamos todas las opciones. Entonces, creo que ahí es donde tenemos que orientar nuestros esfuerzos en hacer una concientización en los sectores académicos y entre los funcionarios de las empresas del sector energético. En esto el CSLF nos está apoyando de manera muy decidida para desarrollar capacidad. El tema sobre la disposición del Congreso a destinar partidas presupuestales. El tema es un tema muy controvertido y además, dada la situación política de México, pues cualquier tema se puede aprovechar para sacar ventaja política. Sin embargo, yo creo que lo que ha expresado el presidente es perfectamente válido. Hay una cierta capacidad de destinar ciertos recursos para proyectos de esta naturaleza, pero si se logra el apoyo internacional, las metas que se fije México podrán ser más agresivas. Ya, de hecho, hay iniciativas como la que está trabajando el Centro Mario Molina, apoyada con fondos de la Comisión Federal de Electricidad, que están caminando. Son todavía las inversiones menores de los estudios de factibilidad y tendrá que llegar un momento en que se tome la decisión grande de si se invierten o no se invierten $800 millones en un proyecto o no. Pero creo que va a tomar tiempo, pero no lo veo como una cosa insalvable. Creo que sí es necesario, sin embargo, que se genere un consenso, si no total, que nunca podrá ser, sí un consenso mayoritario entre el personal técnico que toma estas decisiones en el país.
Je vais demander à Marcela Orozco de nous transmettre 2 questions qui nous parviennent des sessions webcast. Merci.
Okay, thank you, Laurent. I have 2 questions. The first one is, earlier today, Marlo Reynolds made the point that CCS would necessarily be led by the private sector. However, Bob Wright has emphasized the billions being spent by the U.S. to stimulate this technology. The McKinsey Global Cost Abatement Curve shows CCS to be the most expensive option of all possible GHG mitigation measures. At what point and how will the private sector be required to integrate CCS in the construction or retrofitting of power production? And the second question is on terrestrial carbon sequestration. Mexico is unique in North America in that it has both tropical and subtropical forests. From a North American perspective, what are the opportunities and mechanisms to stimulate reforestation or reduced emissions from degradation, REDS, in Mexico or other NAFTA countries?
Thank you.
I maybe didn't take enough time to indicate that although we are spending billions of dollars, it's really to build the infrastructure for the private sector to deploy or implement carbon capture and storage. The scale at which it must be done is something that certainly the government of the United States couldn't do in a very quick or efficient fashion. So knowing where the potential sinks are, knowing where the sources are, developing the technology, helping develop the regulations that would be required. You heard someone this morning talk about a run-of-the-river hydro project and how many different permits. It's very much the same thing in the United States. The question is we have to be out there doing these projects to find out what permits are actually required and where there's a gap or where there's reluctances to work with those people. So again, it is the private sector in the United States that will be implementing CCS, and that will only happen when there is a price on carbon, which means there must be climate change legislation passed by our Congress and signed by our President.
Thank you.
Sí, sobre el mismo tema, ¿en qué punto participaría el sector privado? Bueno, se comentó que el sector privado participará cuando lo tenga que hacer. Y esto será cuando haya o incentivos o impuestos o tarifas que sean mayores que los sobrecostos que tiene el secuestro y la captura de dióxido de carbono. Sobre el informe de McKinsey, yo diría que en esto ha habido también mucha confusión, no está muy claro cómo están evaluados esos sobrecostos. A mí me parece, sí, efectivamente sé que McKinsey habla que CCS es una de las medidas más caras y efectivamente hay unas más baratas como son la eficiencia energética, que no solamente no tienen costos, sino que tienen un ahorro. Sin embargo, yo creo que el estudio realizado o publicado por la Agencia Internacional de Energía es muy claro. CCS debe ser parte del portafolio de acciones y si se intentara lograr las metas de reducción planteadas para el 2050 sin tomar CCS, el costo de mitigación se incrementaría en un 70%. O sea, es que no hay ninguna de las tecnologías que pueda resolver todo por sí mismas. Todas ellas tienen rendimientos decrecientes y por eso es que se necesita el conjunto de todas al mismo tiempo para lograr las metas planteadas.
Dr. Kurtz.
So the question that I received was about the avoidance of deforestation and opportunities that exist for that. I'll start in Canada because that's the place I understand the best on this issue. Under the reporting requirements of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, we, like other signatory countries, must report annually on the emissions associated with land use change, that is the conversion of land from and to forests, and of course the emissions are primarily associated with the conversion of forest to non-forest land. In Canada, we lose about 50,000 hectares per year out of over 300 million hectares of forest to deforestation. These losses account for about 20 megatons of CO2 per year in emissions. That's about 2.6% of our emissions in other sectors. So it's a relatively minor contribution, but it is recognized as one that is of concern, certainly in this province. And as you heard earlier this morning, our provincial government has introduced on Monday legislation in Parliament to introduce a zero net deforestation policy that is aimed at reducing the rates of deforestation in British Columbia, and where deforestation is unavoidable, to replant new forests on non-forest land in order to maintain the carbon uptake capacity of forests. In the United States, we don't know those statistics. The United States does not currently report on the emissions associated with deforestation, but if I talk to my colleagues in the U.S. Forest Service, the anticipation is that these numbers would be a larger proportion than the emissions are in Canada. And in Mexico, of course, the emissions are much greater. Again, I don't know what the proportion is. I'm not even sure that we fully know that number. But clearly, deforestation in Mexico, like in many other developing countries, is a very serious source of concern. The good news is that the world community has recognized this as a very serious problem. It is, as I said in my presentation, contributing globally about 18% of anthropogenic emissions. So reducing deforestation wherever it is occurring is clearly one of the important mitigation wedges. And the world is increasingly prepared to finance that. I think the various meetings that have occurred around Copenhagen and since Copenhagen have clearly indicated that there are a number of countries willing to commit significant dollars to addressing that problem. Where the discussions still occur is how that is best achieved, how these dollars from the developing world can best be deployed the dollars from the developed world can be deployed in the developing world to reduce deforestation, and in particular to find ways to provide the people who depend on these processes with alternative livelihoods. That's where the recent debate about REDD+ comes in, where we're not only talking about avoidance of deforestation, but also a transition of the communities and the forest sector towards a sustainable forest management that ensures a sustained revenue source for the communities, for those that depend on the livelihood, through the use of extractable and non-extractable uses of the forests, through non-timber resources, ecotourism, and various other options that are being discussed. So I think, in summary, that there are a number of tremendous opportunities. I think that, as always with these things, the very first thing had to be for the rest of the world to understand that deforestation and land use change is a very significant problem. I think the work of the IPCC and others has highlighted the contribution, the magnitude of that role, and there is now a willingness to pay for addressing it. The mechanisms on how to best achieve that are still under development, but I'm quite hopeful that significant progress will be made. And with all of these things, as we transform societies, there will be mistakes, there will be some failures, there will be some misappropriation of funds somewhere, but that's just the cost of doing business. I think the majority of the community is now moving towards addressing these issues in a very aggressive way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're taking a last question for today, unless there's someone else in the room, but Tinker Desai from JPAC, United States. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I'm very much interested in this. All four they're great presentation, by the way, with different philosophy, different thinking. But what is the one common technology we can use in the near future, and the average North American can understand, hey, this is good, let's go in? Which one is one technology you guys can recommend right now for either of the government can implement right now, either through finding the right geological information and pumping carbon into that formation, or trunking the CO2 for oil recovery, or the third one, which was deforestation we talked about? Which one is the least expensive right now? And we can go on with this. Which common North American can understand what it is, so it can be politically acceptable right away,
I'm not sure I caught the first part of your question, so I'm going to give an answer. And that is, as you look at all those technologies that might contribute to the reduction of CO2 emissions, the two that can be done today are efficiency on the supply side and efficiency on the demand side. There are a number of issues that need to be addressed with doing that, but certainly those efficiency improvements are possible. Anything else that you pick, and whether it's where do you implement CCS, and there are a number of different answers to that, or whether you want to do nuclear energy, okay, which is obviously carbon-free, or do we do more renewables, and where there is wind potential, we don't have the transmission lines. All those are, I would say, very challenging situations that only the politicians are going to be able to answer. And we, as I said, I came here certainly knowing not to make any policy. I think what I view the role of the Department of Energy to do is, as the politicians, especially Congress, propose different pieces of legislation, is to be able to go in and objectively say, well, if this legislation were implemented, you know, EIA can tell you the impact on the economy, and we can tell you sort of what some of the technological impacts are, but we respond more to policies they propose. Then the question you may ask is, what do we do first?
Where do the natural gas comes in the, where it's in the part of the equation? So much natural gas, especially in the U.S. and probably in the Canada too. Right. Why is not a...
Well, Nat, there's a couple issues here. Maybe there's a couple, two. I look at it two ways, which is we keep talking about 2050 as sort of our end date. And if you look at the people who model out to 2100, which is, you know, modeling out even to 2050 is a challenge, you will find that you're going to have to use CCS on natural gas. The end point is so low, all right, that as you work your way back and say, what do you have to do today? And the focus tends to be on, let's say, coal or refineries. But the people who do the modeling very far out will say, well, you have to use CCS with natural gas, all right? The second part is, yes, recently with unconventional sources of natural gas, there's a lot of gas out there, and in the next decade or two, that looks like a possibility. But the challenge is none of those companies are willing to sign long-term contracts. It was only 5 years ago that gas in the United States was pushing $14 per million BTUs, and everyone was very unhappy about that. It's now $4, and it's plentiful. And everyone is saying, well, why don't we do this? Well, when you go to get financing for projects, the banks, remember, 5 years ago when it was $14. And since you can't sign a long-term contract with anybody, they aren't about to take the risk.
Thank you very much. Werner, last intervention, please.
Just one additional set of answers to your question. First of all, there is no one silver bullet technology. We really cannot afford to not look at all possible mitigation wedges. We have to develop ways in which we compare across the different sectors what the costs per ton of CO2 abatement are. And we need to not look at average costs, but we need to look at the cost curve, because there are a lot of things in different sectors that we can do at costs that are significantly cheaper than CCS, and we must not leave those things untried. The last point is that it is, particularly when you deal with sectors like agricultural land management, forest land management, and other sort of terrestrial systems, there is a lot more than carbon at stake, and there are a lot of co-benefits, whether that's hydrological impacts, biodiversity impacts, etc. And so if we do things that are good for carbon, they can also often be good for other aspects that are important for communities, for people, for the ecology and the biology. And somehow we need to find ways of factoring these into the thinking and also ensure that we think beyond carbon and climate mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, is our time over? How are we doing on time? Nancy. Nancy. You haven't asked a question today, so.
I have. This is more of a comment and observation just from the discussion. I thought Werner's approach on forest mitigation for low carbon approach was really fascinating. And when we talk about nuclear power generation, we talk about it as a zero emitter. But if we take the approach of mine mouth to refining, the transportation, 3 times around the world, I understand, to construction and then operation of nuclear, we may have a different view of nuclear in the charts as opposed to CCS, forest mitigation, gas and hydro, and the other renewables that we've talked about. So I just think that it is something that we need to, goes to defining how we account for things. And it really, that definition is so key right across our 3 countries.
Thank you. How are we doing on time? One more comment?
Yeah, I'm not really a nuclear proponent. I think the technology has to participate, but there have been several studies done on life cycle CO2 emissions of nuclear power, including the mining, the processing, and all that, and still they come out with a very low number of emissions. So the studies are there. Thank you.
Thank you. I would now like to invite our chairman, our JPAC chairman, Glenn Wright, to offer a little gift to all our panelists and to make his conclusions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for doing that, Laurent. We have Ecoregions of North America, which is a publication of the Commission. And I'm going to see that you get the English one. The English one's in the right hands, and there's the Spanish. Well, I would like to add my thank you to the panelists. We've had a very substantive day with a lot of very good input. I was really looking forward to getting the update on the carbon capture and storage. If you recall back to our morning session when we had the graph showing what type of production of power is used in the various parts of North America, it becomes very clear with the coal, how many, 200 years of coal availability, is that approximately correct? With 200 years of coal available and the number of long-term expensive infrastructure investments in those types of facilities, on a personal level, I think it's probably unrealistic to think that we can solve our problems without some technology that's going to assist in, and I'm pleased to see that there's as much progress on carbon capture and storage as there is. Price may not, it will obviously be a fact at some point, but if it starts to become one of your only options, it's amazing what it'll do to price. To go back to a little bit to the beginning of the day, the fact that society, in fact, cannot function without adequate and appropriate levels of supply of electricity. Even if we go back to some of our previous sessions and discussions where the electric car is brought up, you know, it's a wonderful idea, but you better find some place to plug it in. And then you're going to have enough electrons to take care of that. So it's pivotal to the future solutions to our climate. I did especially enjoyed the terrestrial discussion and forest management. It's a subject that I personally haven't had a lot of exposure to. In my former life, managing a large transmission company, forestry was something you did so they didn't knock your lines down. But I enjoyed and found it very informative. So it's been a good day. Just get my notes here for the wrap-up as we get ready to close the meeting. We've had good participation over the course of the day here from many people in BC attending. We've had a substantial audience on our webcast and questions coming in. It's our attempt to continue to develop our web capabilities, because the challenge of getting public input and reaching out to the public on these issues with a very limited budget is challenging. So this is, I think, our third broadcast, and what we're doing is we're refining the technology and we're refining our use of it. And I've had a number of emails today from people in Hawaii and other places all over the place saying that, you know, the quality of the broadcast was really good. One of them was actually my son that sent me an email, and he's young and very critical of broadcast quality because he has the finest digital everything you can get. So I don't understand how to run it, but if he tells me it's good quality, I'm sure it passes the test. So we're making inroads there. We will continue to disseminate information about our meetings and locations and times so that we can be available to people on the web and in person where we are geographically located for them. There was a lot of important information today. We will be convening, I'll be asking the JPAC members to, we're going to break for a few minutes to stretch our legs, and then we'll reconvene here in the room privately to have a discussion around framing our advice. But I've already had input back from many members saying that the material today will generate important advice for us to draft an advice letter to the ministers from each of our countries. So that's been very helpful. We do appreciate it. It's been a bit of a long day in some respects, but it's been well worth it. The other thing is our working group. We will be meeting in here after about a 10 or 15-minute break. And we will be posting the next meetings. Now, I wanted to take a moment to thank, first of all, Nancy and Laurent for assisting me in hosting today. Thank you very much. You guys did a great job of facilitating and helping keep the meeting moving along and productive. I also want to acknowledge the effort put in by the Commission staff in helping us arrange the meeting. Many conferences that are being planned, Marcella, Jocelyn, and Liliana is here, yes. And so we've had other members of all three governments have had members of their organizations from their environmental groups and from Canada, Mexico, and the United States. We appreciate them being here. Oh yes, and a good important note is that all presentations that have been done today will be available on our website, the Commission website, so you can get the materials there, and that will be most helpful and available. And if you have questions and things, you can communicate. There are opportunities to submit questions on the website, and we will see that they're followed up with in a reasonable timeline. So I think we're in reasonable shape. What I would do is just open the floor for a moment before we adjourn. Is there any further comments from my colleagues at JPAC colleagues before we terminate the public meeting?
I would like
Tinker?
to, on your behalf, I would like to thank the translation speech people. They did a great job.
Very good point. The translation services, excellent. Our sound and our webcast staff, I would have to say, is having dealt with them, it's been a seamless and a very effective support team here, and you've merged. All three of these groups have to merge their technology to effectively get us out on the web and to get us in the room. Sometimes our challenge for our translators is we're not all used to dealing with translation. You should usually start off, say a couple of words that don't matter too much, and give them a chance to get the button switched. So we don't always, we're not always the easiest group to provide services. So that was a very good observation. Nellie, comment?
Thank you, Glenn. I just have a question for you. Is the meeting after the break, is that a JPAC meeting for the follow-up of our administrative
Yes.
matters, or just a working group?
Okay, we're going to meet all of us, not just the working group, because we have some logistics and business issues we need to deal with, and see if we can conclude that tonight, and we may not have to reconvene early tomorrow morning. Some people have travel, travel arrangements for that. So if we can stay behind, we'll sort out our agenda and deal with some of the administrative issues, and probably also receive any input that each of the members have on key points that they think should be considered on the writing of the advice. We already have some notes being submitted. Any further comments from my colleagues? Okay, well, again, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the presenters. And I thank you to the audience we can't see out there that looked in on the web. I adjourn the meeting. Thank you.